The North American Society for Oceanic History was created by maritime scholars who met in 1971 at the University of Maine. They recognized that in North America there was no forum for maritime history or a society devoted to the study and promotion of maritime history. The aim of the original group of organizers was to create a diverse organization based initially on Canadian and American membership, which would gain the interest of others. Now there are members worldwide, and it is this diversity of membership that continues to make NASO a truly unique organization. 2020 marked the first year in recent memory that NASO was unable to meet, and therefore we bring historians, archaeologists, and students who are scheduled to present. Welcome to the North American Society for Oceanic History podcast. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. The goal of the NASO podcast is to bring you some of the best historians, professionals, and up-and-comers in the field of maritime history. Today we're going to the Commonwealth of Virginia and being joined by Dr. William Thiesen. Bill is a longtime member of NASO, serves on the NASO Council. He was a historian at the Wisconsin Maritime Museum and is now the command historian for the U.S. Coast Guard's Atlantic area. Dr. Thiesen will be discussing the United States Coast Guard operations in the Rum War of Prohibition. Welcome, Bill, to the NASO video podcast.
Hey, Sal. Great to be here. Appreciate it.
Bill, I'm 5 episodes in, and I've managed up to this point to avoid having another ECU grad, another East Carolina grad. And it was only a matter of time till the East Carolina mafia of that master's program kind of weaned its way into the NASO podcast. So I'm glad it's you, and it's always a good one to have you on here with us for that. Bill, you've been working on the centennial of the Coast Guard's operations in the Rum War. Coast Guard and many military organizations love anniversaries and centennials in particularly. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that role that the Coast Guard had in Prohibition, which is just a horrific time in our lives, obviously. For maritime historians, the idea of prohibition of alcohol is just, it makes me quake at that image. But if you want to go ahead and talk a little bit about it, we're interested to hear the Coast Guard's role.
Sure. Well, as you're well aware, Coast Guard was first established as a law enforcement agency and always has been. It's also a military agency. And so this was actually the largest law enforcement mission in the history of the service. And it goes back to 1790. It's 230 years. So that's a pretty big mission. It all started with the enactment of Prohibition in 1919, and then the enforcement policies that went into effect in 1920. And so it went on for about 13 years. And if you can imagine, for those who actually know their Civil War history, there was a plan to blockade, naval blockade of the U.S. coast to kind of provide a stranglehold for the seceded southern states. That's kind of what the Coast Guard was tasked with in 1920, to put a stranglehold on any liquor coming into the states from foreign countries, with a very, very small force of Coast Guard cutters and personnel. So it was really a baptism of fire, and you could say that Prohibition and the Coast Guard's role in enforcing the law on the high seas, inland waterways, and lakes of the U.S. Was really a baptism of fire, and it brought the Coast Guard really into the 20th century and made it a modern service as opposed to a service that was developed in the 1800s. So it kind of brought out of the age of sail, out of antiquated technology and bureaucratic structures into the 20th century. And really turned it into, in some ways, what it still is today. A much more modern agency, able to respond to a variety of different law enforcement issues. So that's kind of what Prohibition did for the service. When it started out in 1920, the Coast Guard was ill-equipped to handle the role it would play to keep liquor out of the U.S. From any kind of maritime transportation. And by 1924, I think the federal government realized that the Coast Guard was not going to be able to do the job with the the small number of people it had and the small number of assets it had. And so as a result, the Coast Guard developed rapidly, starting in the mid 20s, into a much larger, much better equipped force to take care of what were actually very cunning and well-equipped smugglers. Prohibition smugglers in the early part of the 1920s would moor what they called motherships off the coast. This would be beyond the 3-mile limit, at that point considered territorial waters for the U.S. And so the Coast Guard had to monitor these motherships, and which were carrying cases and cases of liquor. What the motherships would do is they'd offload this liquor to speedboats. We call them go fast today, but these contact boats would take the liquor and smuggle it into different inland waterways, estuaries, and difficult to reach areas of the East Coast, Gulf Coast, West Coast, and probably one of the worst areas, the Great Lakes, which was simply a watery border with Canada, and try to keep that liquor out. And so it was an incredible task for a very small service. As opposed to the blockade of the Civil War, the Coast Guard was a small service, where the Union Navy back in those days in the Civil War was a much larger military agency. So you can see how the Coast Guard would have to ramp up its operations dramatically to try to keep all of these smugglers from bringing their illegal liquor into the U.S. During Prohibition. So as a result, the U.S. Coast Guard increased its size to include over 300 cutters. It was actually the largest, most dramatic increase in personnel and assets in the history of the service outside of World War II, and included over doubling its personnel size from 4,000 individuals to 10,000. So it really was an attempt not only to increase its size to deal with the thousands of incursions that happened almost all the time, but also to try to use new technology that they'd never had before to do the same thing. So as a result, the Coast Guard incorporated code breakers for all of the coded messages that the smugglers would use. They'd be transmitting their messages from the motherships to shore stations and pirate radio stations. Coast Guard established its own Coast Guard Intelligence Office for the first time, and use of aircraft, and also the use of its own radio direction finders to determine where these smugglers were transmitting their messages from, both on shore as well as at sea. So it really was not only an increase in personnel, a dramatic increase in assets, both seaborne and aviation, but it was also an increase in sophistication, using some of the latest methods and technology of code breaking and cryptanalysis, intelligence, radio direction finders, radios, aviation, high-speed Coast Guard cutters, and some of the most advanced seaborne cutters of their day. So that's kind of in a nutshell, kind of what started the whole Prohibition law enforcement mission.
So Bill, I'm taken aback by a couple of things that you just said. First, the Coast Guard itself, I mean, it dates back to 1790 with the Revenue Cutter Service, but it undergoes a transformation in 1915 into what we call today the U.S. Coast Guard. So it's still kind of feeling its way out, I guess, by this time. It just comes out of World War I. It suffers losses as being part of the Navy in World War I. And then it goes into this interdiction operation, which is large scale. As you said, it's the largest operation, biggest expansion of the Coast Guard until you have World War II. I guess the thing that struck me the most in your accounting of these events is how similar it sounds like to their mission today in interdicting drugs and, replace, the vessels that are bringing alcohol ashore with go fast today and narco subs, for example, doing that. And I'm wondering, as a historian for the Coast Guard, how much of your history is used, for example, to kind of direct and influence current operations with the U.S. Coast Guard today?
So a lot of the lessons learned from Prohibition are so similar to what we see today with drug interdiction. The use of aircraft, for example, we have aviation units that do a lot of interdiction. We have the cutters that also do that. We have small boats and small craft that can do things inshore. A lot of the offices and the methods used for tracking and checking on some of the smugglers and where they're going and where they can be interdicted all found their origin in Prohibition. Before Prohibition, there probably wasn't anything like what we would see today and what was started back in 100 years ago in Prohibition. It's a law enforcement agency, and a lot of the methods, as you mentioned, that were used in Prohibition are used today in a much more refined form. Uh, and in fact, we have more capabilities, far more capabilities than we had back in those days. But unfortunately, the mission today is far more sophisticated than it was in those days. So the Coast Guard has to develop the technology and the methods to deal with modern smuggling and drug interdiction. And if you look at how it's going with that, you'll see that anybody who knows much about drug interdiction today realizes that much of it has actually been pushed into the Eastern Pacific. That's where a lot of it takes place today. And large part of that is due to the Coast Guard's success in interdicting the smuggling of drugs on the water in the Gulf and Caribbean areas. So a lot of the lessons learned from Prohibition, they've been carried forward into modern day and have proven very successful and helpful. But I have to admit that the Coast Guard faces similar issues that it dealt with back in Prohibition, which is that there's only so many Coast Guard assets, only so many Coast Guard personnel to deal with an overwhelming amount of smugglers and smuggling assets. It was true back in those days, and it's true today too. So Coast Guard has to use all of the tools and methods at its disposal to try best and most effectively deal with the influx of drugs in the maritime environment. So I think its case has been proven by the fact that so much of the smuggling has been pushed away from the typical channels, which would be the Gulf and the Caribbean. But we still have a lot taking place in the Eastern Pacific, and the Coast Guard is there to try to interdict as much as they can of that illicit smuggling.
For those listening in who may not know much about history of Coast Guard, and I have an opportunity every 2 years at the McMullen Naval History Symposium up at the Naval Academy to listen to you and the other Coast Guard historians. Always put on a panel. It's always a great panel. Always enjoy being at that panel because I learned so much about the Coast Guard. Why the differentiation between the Navy and the Coast Guard? Why have a separate maritime force for the enforcement of laws? Why not just roll that in? Because many nations don't do that. Many nations don't have a Coast Guard. They don't, or they have one force that does both the role of a Navy and a Coast Guard. Why? What makes it unique in the United States to have a standalone maritime force like the Coast Guard, especially doing a mission like this during the period of Prohibition?
Well, the reason that the Coast Guard was founded by Alexander Hamilton was law enforcement. That's it's always been the primary mission of the Coast Guard is law enforcement. Back in those days, the law enforcement mission was to prevent smuggling and to enforce import and export tariffs on maritime shipping and commerce. Because that in the very beginning of the Constitution was the primary role of funding the federal government was through import and export tariffs that were enforced by the Coast Guard back in those days, called the Revenue Cutter Service. However, the law enforcement mission has been carried through, and it's always been the primary mission of the Coast Guard, and it became even more important if you're familiar with posse comitatus, which was the legal legislation drawn up during Reconstruction in which the Union authorities, the Union military was disallowed from enforcing laws in the reconstructed South. After the Civil War, the Union Army was occupying much of the South, and as a result, it was thought illegal for military agencies to enforce laws, or was found as such. And so, as a result, after the Posse Comitatus was drawn up, military agencies were disallowed from doing law enforcement missions. And so the Coast Guard retains that law enforcement mission and to this very day. And so, for example, I'll just give you one example of how that works. In the drug enforcement arena, which we just talked about, you will see Coast Guard teams that are deployed on naval vessels, on destroyers and smaller warships in drug smuggling areas. Now, those naval vessels can fly their own jack, they can fly the Navy flag. However, when a drug enforcement mission comes along and the Coast Guard teams on board that warship are deployed for an operation, that ship must fly the Coast Guard ensign at the top, at its masthead. In essence, it becomes a Coast Guard vessel when it does a drug enforcement mission. And it's the Coast Guard people on board that warship that actually carry out that mission, not the naval personnel on board that warship. So it's kind of a small way of showing just how the law enforcement mission works and how American military organizations are not allowed to enforce laws like the Coast Guard's allowed to do. Does that make sense?
No, that's perfect, and I think it goes to the concept too that the Coast Guard is probably misnamed because it's not a coast force in any way whatsoever. I mean, it has worldwide deployment capabilities too, with cutters today in the Persian Gulf, for example, and deployed, as you said, on U.S. naval assets performing those law enforcement detachments, those leadet operations, like you said.
Right.
Let me come back to the Coast Guard role in Prohibition, because there was something else you mentioned in there. It was really interesting. And I remember listening to a talk that was given. I can't remember if it was you or one of the other Coast Guard historians that talked about it, but it was that intelligence gathering issue. I thought that was really interesting. And there was a correlation between Coast Guard gathering intelligence during the war and Prohibition to actually World War II and actually the run up to Pearl Harbor element. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, how that kind of morphed into the intelligence gathering that the United States was able to do in the run up to the Second World War.
Yeah, the Coast Guard had to use every tool at its disposal during Prohibition, and one of the essential tools, perhaps one of the most important tools at its disposal, was intelligence and code breaking. So as a result, the Coast Guard and the Treasury Department actually hired their first cryptanalyst in Elizabeth Friedman. And anybody who's familiar with the history of U.S. intelligence knows that name. Her husband was one of the founders of the NSA, and actually she's considered one of the founders as well. If you go to the NSA's honor wall, you'll see a picture of William Friedman, and then the next photo down is Elizabeth Friedman. Both of them were experts at breaking codes. And Elizabeth Friedman had actually been working at code breaking for a time in the early 20s, but she decided to leave that job to help raise a family. But the Coast Guard was so desperate for somebody that could break all of these illicit codes from the rum runners that they were able to hire her back to work for the Treasury Department and then for the Coast Guard. And over the course of Prohibition, she broke about 12,000 different coded messages that were transmitted between the motherships and the pirate radio stations on shore that the rum runners used to communicate about shipments, where the fuel was going to be placed, where the boats would offload, where they would onload with the motherships, and so on and so forth. So having these codes broken and knowing where these different operations were taking place really made more sense for the Coast Guard because its assets and personnel were so few compared to the rum runners that they were trying to fight. It made it much more effective to know where things were going to happen in advance so that they could be there and make the apprehension or do the law enforcement mission. So she worked for the Coast Guard for much Prohibition. She was actually an expert witness in a lot of the court cases that were brought against the different mobs that were involved and the smugglers, effectively breaking codes and ensuring that the service was using its assets and technology as effectively as possible. And she actually went on not only to work during Prohibition, but then continued to work for the Coast Guard, because after Prohibition was over, there was a need to work on drug smugglers, because opium was still a big illicit drug that was being smuggled into the States. She helped break a lot of codes for the drug smugglers after Prohibition. And then she also headed during World War II a large, very large code breaking unit that helped to break some of the Enigma codes used by the Germans, primarily in transmissions to spy networks in South America. So she was very effective. And unfortunately, the Coast Guard's intelligence office is not very well known, or actually, it maybe is good for our purposes, but it was a very effective office. And the fact is that the history of spies in general and code breakers is never trumpeted in front of the public very much, because their work is considered classified. And as a result, a lot of the identities of some of the pioneers and trailblazers in this field is usually kept under the radar. But Elizabeth Friedman was a real pioneer, not only because she was one of the, I would say, first great code breakers and intelligence experts, but she was a woman at a time when women had no jobs of this kind. She was really the first in her field. And the Coast Guard is very proud that she was an intelligence analyst and a code breaker for the service at this time when her services were much needed by Prohibition law enforcement in the Coast Guard.
I think what you hit on there is such a key thing. The Coast Guard has been so, it does such a great job at using the assets it has and maximizing, being, you know, a small service and having a large mission. I know thanks to you, I was able to take a group of students from my university down and tour down at a sector in North Carolina not too long ago, and really amazed at the intelligence work that was being done even at the sector level to identify ships coming in and cargoes. And it was really impressive to see how that level is still being done. I mean, you can't obviously track every piece of cargo and inspect every piece of cargo, I should say, coming into the United States. And you can still see that being played out today in many ways. As you mentioned, Prohibition is going to be repealed. The 20th Amendment will repeal the 18th Amendment in 1933. And so that raises the question of an assessment on the war, on the Rum War. Was the Coast Guard effective, or was this an ineffective campaign against Prohibition? Were they able to make inroads against the flow of illegal alcohol coming in, or did the government just realize, oh, we're never going to stop it, let's go ahead and repeal it and let it go? Or was the Coast Guard extremely effective in curtailing it?
Well, the Coast Guard became more and more effective at curtailing it. There's no way that they could have stopped the entire flow of liquor that was coming in, because the sheer numbers were weighted so heavily against the Coast Guard. However, by the time the early 30s came around, the service was huge. It was much larger than it had been. It knew how to use all these new tools that I'd mentioned, including aviation, which was tremendous, because in the old days, the only way you could spot a rum runner would be to have a vessel on the surface on the water. However, by the time the late 1920s came along, the Coast Guard had air stations set up. They had aircraft set up that could see far more of the water's surface from the air than a cutter or a small boat could see from the water. And so the methods changed and became far more modern, and the effectiveness of the law enforcement mission became far more effective as a result. Now, to say that the Coast Guard cut off all flow of liquor into the United States would be misleading, because it did not. However, it did cut off a good portion of it and apprehended a lot of the smugglers in the process. So a lot of the rum runners and people on shore that were involved in the maritime shipment of illegal liquor were apprehended, and there was certainly prison sentences for those who attempted to do so. So it certainly was far more effective towards the early 1930s, but basically the reason why it was repealed is just because of the unpopularity of prohibition and more than anything. But Coast Guard has always risen to the task, and as with the many other missions that it's done, it did the finest work it could in terms of apprehensions as well as curtailing the smuggling of illegal liquor, in spite of the fact that it was a very unpopular task and mission that the Coast Guard had to undertake. Many times the Coast Guard was seen as the bad guy because they were the ones that were responsible for apprehending people bringing in beer or liquor of various kinds that a lot of people wanted to drink.
It does seem that, I mean, this specific mission and the interdiction and the prohibition, and as you mentioned, you're talking about small boat operations, you're talking about boarding operations, you're talking about aircraft and air bases being set up. It really does seem to set the Coast Guard up for success when it comes to World War II, for example, with having these patrol stations established along the coast of the United States, so that when the U-boat offensive takes place, a lot of Coast Guard personnel, unknown to most people, are brought into the Navy in World War II, and they operate a lot of the small boats, the landing craft, the amphibious vessels, and it really seems to be a training ground for the Coast Guard going into World War II, and I think that's a success that isn't touted about enough. I was wondering if your research kind of correlates with that and what you found with it.
Yeah, there's a variety of reasons why prohibition was perhaps in some ways more important than World War One in terms of experience. Because first of all, you have to remember that in 1915, you mentioned that the modern Coast Guard was formed into a military institution. Well, prior to that, it was ancestor agencies. The two in particular were Revenue Cutter Service as well as the Life Saving Service. So the 20s and 30s were a real difficult time for the service because it was trying its best to blend two very different cultures into one service. It had the life-saving service culture of these heroic surfmen that would save lives on the shore, who were very independent and ran their own operations. And then you had the high seas revenue cutter service, which ran more like the Navy with an officer structure and enlisted men on board. And so through the 20s and 30s, how do you blend these two very different cultures, independent cultures, into one service, which is something you see even today. You see different cultures within the service because it has so many different missions. You have AIDS navigation, you have life-saving boat stations still, and you have high seas operators. So that was one of the things that was taking place, was trying to turn the service into one homogeneous culture, which I think had evolved into, by World War II, into more what we see today. Also, Prohibition developed some of our great leaders as well. And I would just probably single out Russell Wacie, who became the four-term commandant of the Coast Guard from 1936 through World War II. This commandant here is Bullard, who was the one responsible for Prohibition, for 8 years of Prohibition. But Wacie is really the man who worked behind the scenes during Prohibition, and in fact, many felt that he was only a commander through much of the 30s, but for the most part, people felt he was kind of the assistant commandant because he was a bureaucratic genius. And he learned virtually everything from intelligence to communications to gunnery to every aspect of the operation of Prohibition and law enforcement Prohibition. So during World War II, when the service mushroomed into 250,000 service personnel, Wacie was at the head, and he was the perfect man. He was the right man at the right time. And much of that was due to the fact that he had really earned his spurs while serving in various offices and units and branches of the service in Prohibition. But also, as you relate to, the service was using all kinds of advanced technology, and many of the it had over 300 cutters that were built for Prohibition. That is tremendous. That's the largest expansion of the service in its history outside of the vessels that had operated in World War II. And it was not only just the new cutters that were built out of steel with diesel power plants and a lot of the modern technology that you would have on a U.S. warship in those days, but also the fact that, as we mentioned before, the service had expanded into all these different offices and technology it never used before, and all of them were used during World War II, from intelligence to radio and radio direction finding, all these modern cutters, aviation. So really, Prohibition, I would say, more than even World War I, gave the Coast Guard the training and the experience that it really used to good effect in World War II.
Bill, I want to take a step back for a second and ask you. I mean, you're the historian for the Atlantic area for the Coast Guard, and all military organizations, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard have historians attached to them. Why do they have historians? What's your basic primary role in that job? Because many people are probably not aware of this, that there are opportunities for historians in military units and government organizations. So I enjoy your articles you write for Naval History and Sea History magazine all the time, and I think those are great. But I know behind the scenes there's a lot more than just publishing and talking about the Coast Guard publicly. So what's the big role for historians within the Coast Guard?
Well, for the Coast Guard, I like to say it's preserve and promote the history of the service, because, and that's more important, I think, for the Coast Guard than it is for other military branches. Coast Guard has always been, let's get the job done, let's go out and get the job done, we'll worry about documenting things later, and we're never going to talk about ourselves, we're not going to trumpet our own mission, we're not going to brag, we're just get the job done, get ready for the next response effort, and just go on and go on. So as a historian, my job is to try to go back and ensure that all the stories, all the important missions, that sort of thing, are documented and preserved for future generations. And it's a lot of work. I'll just tell you that right now, but it's never boring, because in the Coast Guard, Coast Guard has so many missions that nobody can really specialize in anything. It's a multi-mission service, unlike the other military services, which have one mission. Coast Guard has a dozen missions that it does, and that's just a reflection of how people that serve in the Coast Guard also have to be versatile and able to do many different things instead of just one thing only. And that's true for the Coast Guard historians, the people in my office. They better be good at doing oral histories, doing original research and writing. They also have to ensure that records are preserved, because oftentimes Coast Guard's not as good at record keeping as it is as carrying out its tasking and its missions. And so if you go back to 1790 and all the years since then, you'll find so many forgotten missions, forgotten people, and forgotten stories, because the Coast Guard was just too busy carrying out its operations and doing what it does best, which is a variety of different kinds of law enforcement and response missions. And if there was time for these personnel to go back and document things, all the better. But I'll just give you one example. Right now, we're commissioning a fleet of over 60 what we call fast response cutters. And each one of these, for the first time in our history, are going to be named and are named for enlisted personnel in the service who have distinguished themselves somehow. Naturally, there's many more than 60 who have distinguished themselves, but these are stories that were forgotten by the record books and by many historians. And thank goodness that some forward-looking people decided to name these cutters for some of the enlisted heroes of our service who have done amazing things, because if they hadn't been recognized and honored as cutter namesakes, they'd be just as forgotten as the thousands of other Coast Guard men and women who have gone in harm's way and tried to do something good, and many times never came back, because they sacrificed their own lives for the mission. And so as a result, you have to be in my position, you have to be dedicated, but you also have to be good at multitasking. And the variety is very challenging. It's also very interesting, and you're never bored. You may be really tired, but you're never bored. So, in any case, in our work, we have a small staff, but we all do a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Talking about that, I mean, the names given to the FRCs, the fast response cutters, really kind of highlight just the roles and missions of the Coast Guard. And I'm always interested. I follow along, and every time one's commissioned, I'm always interested to read that bio of what that person did, and their role they played in the Coast Guard. Even the naming of the 12 offshore patrol cutters was really interesting because those were famous ships from the Coast Guard, and you read the history of the namesakes prior to them. I think the Coast Guard does an absolutely fantastic job of capturing their history. Sometimes I would argue they're a lot better than the Navy does in capturing that in elements. And I think what you're talking about is public history, and you've been on both sides. You've been on the government side, the federal government side with the Coast Guard, and then you were with the Wisconsin Maritime Museum as curator and historian there. And I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about why someone would get interested into the public history side, and what's the appeal of that versus the professor side like I do, or a more private role of historians working for corporations or businesses and everything. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the public history side.
So, I really enjoyed working at the Wisconsin Maritime Museum. I was there for 5 years, and the thing for me that is a I don't know if you call it a barrier, but it's a way that I contain my enthusiasm is that I have to work with nonfiction. I work with history. I don't work with fictional elements. And so if you want to be creative and you want to do things that are satisfying to you, there's only so many things you can do with history. You can work in the museum field, archives. You could actually be a research analyst of some kind, which would actually get you into researching things. You can be a historian like I am, public historian. Obviously, you can teach. So, but it's still pretty limited these days what you can use a history degree, a history background for. I feel fortunate that I have a job where I can do exactly what I want. When I was at the Maritime Museum, the thing that I found very enjoyable was that I could use history to create, just like in some ways you create a story based on history when you research and write, which is actually the thing I like to do the most. But when you're in a museum environment, and I was there helping create quite a few permanent exhibits and working, expanding the museum to twice its size, you can be creative as well. You take those historical elements and you turn them into a display that people learn from, just like they would if they're reading a book or an article. And in fact, in many ways, it's more creative because you're using graphic elements, you're using artifacts, which actually tell a story as well. So for many people, working in the museum field is, if you're into history, can be very rewarding. It can be very creative. Um, and working with the artifacts, which is something I don't do anymore, I think is very interesting too. Looking at an artifact like a flintlock pistol from the Revenue Cutter Service days, or looking at some other artifact from the 1790s or early 1800s, it's very emotive. And as you know, a lot of those artifacts tell their own story. If you analyze them enough, you can analyze them just like you would a document. And so for people that are interested in something that's three-dimensional, that's an object as opposed to a piece of paper, that can be the way to go. And in fact, many times when I talk to people about their interest in history, and I talk to quite a few about their interest in history, I ask them, okay, for you and me, history can actually be broken down into many different facets. And people say, well, I just love history. Well, that's actually a very broad statement if you think about it, because what in history is it that actually excites you? Is it reading a book, or is it looking at records? Some people, they love to do research, but they couldn't care less about writing something. Some people love artifacts, and they just have no interest in writing or researching. And these are all different facets of history. So I think the important thing for somebody who may be getting into the field is to get to the core issue of what exactly is it about history that excites you, or maybe it's just a time period. Maybe you love Civil War history and hate everything else. You better know that when you start out, because you might make a mistake and work in the museum field, and you really would rather be teaching or promoting it that way. So I really think that people who say they love history, well, they need to actually refine that and tell themselves, if they want to move forward with that field, what exactly about history it is that excites them. And I think that's helped me a lot too.
Well, no, I think your career definitely shows that track you've been following, and I said it's a very interesting one. Again, I follow the academic one, the teaching one, and you've kind of gone on this different one, and I think there's always something out there for a historian if there's a particular area they like, and more importantly, if there's a particular field they like to do. I think you're exactly right. Is finding that what is it that makes them happy and makes them produce things as they do. I know this is a little outside your purview, but I was wondering if you could just talk briefly about the potential for a Coast Guard museum opening up. I know they've been talking about that for a while now, and there was one attached with the Coast Guard Academy up in New London. So I was just wondering for our viewers if we can just mention that a little bit.
Yeah, well, the one that's at the Academy was really the only one that the Coast Guard has had. I should say it's not in the past tense. It still exists, but obviously with COVID, nothing's available to the public right now. But that is the largest Coast Guard run museum that we have, as opposed to Navy, which has probably a dozen in any case. The Coast Guard Museum in New London is moving. It's moving faster now in terms of its progress than it ever has before. I believe the current timeline has it opening in 2024. However, the properties identified, exhibits and architectural planning are underway, and I think they will be completed soon. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see some actual work taking place on the New London waterfront within the next several months or a year. So it is going to happen. It will be employing a staff. So that's good news for New London. It's not as large as many other national military museums, but it's large enough to, well, it's much larger than we have right now, that's for sure. It will be a multi-story modern structure right on the waterfront. If for people who have any idea where New London is or what the waterfront looks like, there is the railroad station in downtown. It will be located right next to that, and it will look out on the water. It'll have a pier for the Eagle to moor at, so the Eagle will be moored there when it's not out cruising, and also have pierage and wharf area for small boats and other Coast Guard assets that may anchor there as well and be used for public tours, things of that nature. But it will house artifacts. It'll have interactive exhibits. It has an auditorium. It'll have a huge STEM teaching area for education for schools and school groups. So it's going to encompass a lot of different tasks as a museum, and hopefully will be a center for learning for anything associated with the Coast Guard's missions or maritime history for the entire region, and hopefully for people traveling, coming from other parts of the country or the world as well. So hopefully that we'll see that happen in the next few years.
Bill, if people are interested in learning more about history of Coast Guard and the roles and missions the Coast Guard has played, what's some good places to go, some good books to read, or recommendations you would have for them, besides, of course, your articles?
So there is a website the historian's office runs. All you'd have to do is type in the keywords Coast Guard Historian's Office, and that website will be at the top of your list of a Google search. And that it has menus you can scroll down for various aspects of the Coast Guard, Coast Guard's history. I run a blog series that has stories, new stories every week, and it's on the Coast Guard Compass website. So if you were to Google Coast Guard Compass blog, That particular one will come up, and my series is called The Long Blue Line. And if you Google the long blue line, you'll see there's over 200 articles now that have run since over the past 10 years. And they cover every aspect of history from events, people, response efforts, Coast Guard cutters, aviation, you name it. Trying to cover all the highlights of the history, but for 230 years, that's a lot of highlights. So we're still working on that, but we have stories to go for the next 5 years, every week. So there's a lot of history there. But as far as books are concerned, I would say probably the best book, and I'm not sure it's still in print, but there are a lot of editions out there, is Guardians of the Sea is probably one of the best ones for modern Coast Guard. However, you'll find, I think, and I hope it's true, that there's far more books and movies and documentaries about Coast Guard's history, current missions that are coming out or have come out in recent years than any other time in its history. I'm very happy about that. Finest Hours, The Guardian. There's been 3 or 4 different Coast Guard related movies, and there's others that are being produced that are on the way as well. So you can keep your eyes out for those as well.
And I appreciate those recommendations. We'll put all those in the show notes so that people can scroll down at the bottom of the video and grab those and head on over to them. Well, Bill, I appreciate all that. Is there any further things you want to add before we close out our talk today?
So I would say to anybody that has an interest in maritime history that, in my humble opinion, that Coast Guard history is the richest that you'll find for any federal agency in the history of the U.S. I know a lot of people look at the Navy, the Marine Corps, perhaps they look at other military agencies as having a rich history. However, none has as many missions as the Coast Guard has carried out since 1790. And in fact, Coast Guard is the first continuous sea service in the history of the United States as well. The Navy being reestablished in 1798. But there are so many forgotten stories, even Prohibition. If you look at Prohibition, which we were just talking about, there's really only one seminal work on Prohibition book called the Rum War. And there's virtually little else that's ever been written. This is probably one of the most important stories in maritime history for the U.S., and yet there's very little that's been written. So anybody who's interested in striking out and finding some really good stories, some really good topics to research, some history that really needs to be written. The Coast Guard's history is a blank slate in many ways. I mean, the stories that I've researched and written, I'm just scratching the surface. I mean, it's just the tip of the iceberg. If you look at Navy history, Marine Corps, some of those other ones, there have been multiple books written about one event or one battle or one war. If you look at the Coast Guard, sometimes there's none. In fact, most of the time there's none. So it's a rich history. There's many documents and records in the National Archives for Prohibition. It's just a motherlode of records and documents for that particular mission. And I know of perhaps 1 or 2 people that are actually looking at those records. Other than that, I mean, it deserves much more attention, as does the Coast Guard's history writ large. So I really recommend anybody who's interested in finding out more, if they're just interested in reading about the maritime history of the United States, read Coast Guard history and perhaps Revenue Cutter Service history. If you want to do research or write history about the maritime history of the U.S., then get in contact with me or somebody else. We'll set you straight. We've got all kinds of topics that have never been written about. They're forgotten stories and they're huge. So I just would put that out there for anybody interested in that sort of genre. And I'm happy to help anybody that wants to get started.
And I will echo that, Bill. I can't tell you how many times I've been sitting in conferences listening to you and your associates talk on a subject. It's like, okay, I really want more now. And it's like, well, we got to move on to the next thing, or the next anniversary is coming up. And you're right. There's such a rich history about it. And I also add too, as before I became an academic, I was a merchant mariner for 7 years. And it was the Coast Guard that certified my license. They're the ones who came on board and did our inspections. And we weren't always 100% happy to see the Coast Guard show up at times. But I'll tell you what, when you're a mariner and bad things happen, you want no one else but the U.S. Coast Guard to show up. When there's disaster, when there's panic, when there's horror happening, and everybody's running one way, the Coast Guard's going the other way. And I think that history and that element, and we've seen them time and time again in natural disasters and in wars and contingencies, do those missions that very few others will do. And I think there are great stories that are, like you said, are just not tapped. I mean, you can pick any one of the FRCs that have been just named and probably write a book about any one of those individuals and what they did. And I think you're just, whetting people's appetite. So I hope maybe from this we get some people interested who thinking about a topic right now to delve into, and they start thinking about some Coast Guard, some revenue cutter, some life-saving service, some lighthouse service, elements out there. I think it's a great, rich topic. So I want to thank Bill Thiesen for joining us for our NASO podcast. I've known Bill a long time, and I really appreciate coming in. I will also take a moment and recommend, as always, his book that I have used in my class for a long time. Bill wrote a great book, Industrializing American Shipbuilding. It's a great book. I teach a course with marine engineers, and they absolutely consume that book, and it shows the diversity of maritime historians. So I want to thank Bill for joining us on the NASO video podcast. You can see much of Bill's work in the pages of Naval History and Sea History magazines. We'll put links to all the things Bill referenced in the YouTube page and on the podcast page. If you liked our podcast, be sure to click like on YouTube or give it 5 stars on your podcast provider. Please subscribe to our channel to receive updates as we continue to interview maritime historians. You can follow NASO on Facebook or on Twitter at NASO_history. The best way to follow NASO is to become a member, as you receive our newsletter, our quarterly journal, The Northern Mariner, which we publish jointly with the Canadian Nautical Research Society. You can go to www.naso.org and click on membership to join. Until our next talk, keep sailing and Semper Paratus.